As the Second World War ended, it wouldn't take more than 5 years before the Soviets received the truly special RPD light machine gun. This weapon completely redefined modern warfare. It served as the very first dedicated squad automatic weapon, or SAW. From its terrifying use in Black Ops 2 to the car mount in Mad Max, you've probably seen this thing everywhere. But most people underestimate just how influential the RPD truly was, and the hell it unleashed in the jungles of Vietnam and the desert hills of Afghanistan. So that's what you'll hear today. But I have to warn you before we get into today's video, some of what you're going to hear you won't forget easily. You see, the Soviets had a problem the World War had just kept rubbing in their faces. Their main squad gun was the Degtyaryov DP, and it was a good piece of kit, but it was a heavy old thing, chambered for the full-power 7.62 x 54mm rifle round. That was the same cartridge their grandfathers had been firing since 1891. That big-rimmed round forced the gun to feed from a flat pan magazine that sat on top like a dinner plate, and it was slow to reload and awkward to carry around. On top of that, the pan was a fragile thing, and a single hard knock could dent it just enough to jam the whole gun solid. And the Red Army had just watched the Germans fight a whole new kind of war, one built around volume of fire, where a squad lived or died by how much lead it could throw downrange in the opening seconds. So they wanted something lighter, something a single man could carry and feed all on his own, something that could hose down a tree line without breaking his back. And the answer was already sitting in their arsenal. Around 1943, they had cooked up a brand new intermediate cartridge, the 7.62 x 39mm, a shorter and softer kicking round you might know better as the bullet the AK-47 would later make famous. Now, 3 of the Soviet Union's best designers were handed the same brief: build the gun that fires this new round. And the man whose name was already on half the army's machine guns, Vasily Degtyaryov, won the contest. His design was accepted in 1944, which is where that 5-year timeline comes from. But here is the first twist most people miss. The gun was finished on paper, yet it barely existed in the real world for almost 10 years. After the Great Patriotic War ended, the urgency drained away, and large-scale deliveries of the RPD didn't actually start reaching troops until 1953. So for nearly a decade, this revolutionary weapon was more rumor than reality. But when it finally arrived, it arrived as something nobody else on Earth had, and you need to understand exactly what made it so special, because every horror later in this video flows straight out of its design. You see, the RPD weighed a touch over 16 pounds, and that is before you even load it, which still made it a featherweight for a belt-fed gun. It fired from an open bolt, full auto only, and it fed from a 100-round belt coiled inside a metal drum that clipped onto the bottom. That belt was actually 2 50-round lengths joined together, and the gun could spit it all out at up to 750 rounds a minute. A single soldier could sling it over his shoulder, walk all day, and still throw out the kind of fire that used to need a 2-man crew and a tripod. It was also dead simple to strip and clear, which matters a great deal when you are knee-deep in a swamp and the shooting has already started. The American M60 these gunners would later face in the jungle was nearly 7 pounds heavier than that. And that one idea, one man, belt-fed, mobile fire built around a small round, is the blueprint nearly every squad machine gun since has copied. From the American SAW to the modern stuff still in service today, they all trace straight back to this gun. So where does the RPD first show its face on a real battlefield? Well, it pops up in one of the most humiliating military adventures of the entire 20th century, the Suez Crisis of 1956. Egypt's leader, Nasser, seized the Suez Canal, and Britain, France, and Israel thought of a scheme to take it back by force. Now, a year earlier, the Soviets had sneakily armed Egypt through a massive arms deal funneled via Czechoslovakia, and tucked inside those shipments were brand new RPDs. They were some of the very first to ever see combat outside Soviet hands. And the fighting at Suez was incredibly strange, because the side that won on the ground still managed to lose the entire war. Britain and France won almost every battle in the field, and then lost everything at the negotiating table when the Americans and Soviets forced them to pull out in disgrace. But here is the detail that proves the RPD was there, and it's a chilling little artifact. When British and French paratroopers stormed the city of Port Said, they captured an Egyptian RPD in the fighting, and that gun ended up in the Imperial War Museum in London. So the very first overseas trip this weapon ever took ended with one of them being ripped from dead or fleeing hands and carried back to Britain as a trophy. Egypt lost the shooting war badly, with hundreds of its soldiers killed, and tens of thousands marched off as prisoners, and a good slice of their shiny new Soviet kit was simply looted off the battlefield. And that sets up the pattern for the rest of its life, because the RPD was about to find the one place where it became an absolute nightmare to fight against. Now, before we get to the jungle of Vietnam, you have to understand the one flaw baked into this gun. The RPD has a barrel that is fixed in place, and you cannot swap it out. Most serious belt-fed machine guns, like the MG42, let you tear off a glowing hot barrel and slap a fresh one on in seconds, so you can keep hammering away all day. The RPD can't do that in a hurry, and the Soviet designers made that choice on purpose. Their logic was that this gun was built for short, sharp bursts, not endless sustained fire, and that the barrel would heat up at roughly the same moment a gunner burned through his ammo load anyway. So why bother with the weight and the fiddly mechanism of a quick-change barrel? But the soldiers who actually carried it found the dark side of that choice fast. The wooden handguard wraps right around the barrel, and after only a couple hundred rounds fired quickly, that wood gets so hot it starts to burn, leaving the gunner with nothing safe to grip but the bipod. So if you as a soldier were too greedy, you would get punished harshly. Spray too long and it would cook itself, but use it the way it was designed, in vicious little bursts, and it was deadly, light, and almost perfect for one specific kind of war. And that one perfect war was Vietnam. The Americans and South Vietnamese first reported running into the RPD in April 1964, right as they started clashing with regular North Vietnamese army troops instead of just guerrillas. And it spread like wildfire down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, swiftly shoving aside the older DPM to become the standard light machine gun of both the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. Demand got so high that China started churning out its own licensed copy, the Type 56, and began shipping them to Hanoi by the truckload. Now, you might wonder why a gun with a barrel that overheats would thrive in a war zone, and the answer is that Vietnam was tailor-made for everything the RPD did well. Most jungle firefights weren't long, grinding battles at range. They were ambushes, sudden eruptions of violence at close quarters that were over in a couple of minutes. And in that kind of fight, the RPD was king. A Viet Cong gunner only needed 2 or 3 50-round belts to wreck an entire American patrol, and he could fire all of that before the barrel ever became a problem. The gun was inaccurate past 300 meters, but in a war where most firefights happened inside 180, that flaw barely mattered. It was short, it was light enough to swing around in thick undergrowth, and it chewed up targets at close to medium range like a buzzsaw. And because it fired from an open bolt and swallowed that stubby little round, it kept running even when it was filled with debris and mud. The price was paid by the gunner himself, who had to hump those heavy drums through the heat while staying close enough to anchor every single fight. And there was a sneaky second advantage too, and it was all about ammo. Because the RPD fired the exact same 7.62 x 39mm round as the AK-47, a North Vietnamese squad could share bullets between their rifles and their machine gun without a second thought. Every infantry squad had one, sitting right at the heart of their firepower. Meanwhile, the Americans were juggling 5.56 rounds for their M16s and a totally different 7.62mm round for their M60s, which turned resupply in the field into a genuine headache. So picture the typical horror an American patrol walked into. They'd be moving down a trail, tense and sweating, when the bushes suddenly began firing at them. The opening burst of an ambush almost always came from the RPD, the heaviest gun in the enemy squad, and it would tear into the front of the column, while the AKs opened up from the flanks. You see, the RPD gunner was the anchor of the whole thing, because his job was to pin that patrol in place with a wall of fire, while everyone else worked around the sides. He would dump a belt in long raking sweeps. His mates would peel back into the trees while he covered them, and by the time the smoke thinned, there was usually nobody left to shoot back at. By the time the Americans worked out where the fire was coming from and brought their own heavier M60 to bear, the ambushers were already retreating back into the green, with 0 drum mags left. And these hit-and-run massacres happened again and again across the entire war. By the late 1960s, the RPD and its Chinese twin were everywhere along the trail, and almost every serious firefight an American GI lived through had one of them in it somewhere. In fact, the gun was so prized that American special forces running secret missions across the border would carry captured RPDs themselves. They did it so the enemy couldn't tell friend from foe by the sound of the gun, and so they could feed it with ammo stripped off the people they were hunting. But the very thing that made the RPD so brilliant in the jungle, its lightweight and its small fast round, also planted the seed of its downfall. because back in Moscow, the people who designed this gun were already looking at it with deep disappointment. But before we get to why the Soviets fell out of love with their own creation, the RPD had one more brutal war left in it, and this one is soaked in irony. In 1979, the Soviet Union poured into Afghanistan, expecting a quick job, and instead got bogged down in a decade-long meat grinder against the Mujahideen. Now, by this point, the Soviet regular army had long since retired the RPD from its frontline units. But the gun didn't disappear, it just changed sides. You see, the Mujahideen were armed by a wild mix of sources, with the CIA, China, Egypt, and others funneling weapons through Pakistan. But a huge chunk of their arsenal came from one place. It came from the bodies and the bases of the very men they were fighting. They stripped Soviet ordnance off destroyed convoys and overrun outposts by the truckload, and among that loot were RPDs. So a Soviet machine gun, born to give the Red Army its edge, ended up in the hands of mountain fighters using it to ambush Soviet columns in the passes. And the RPD was perfectly suited to that life all over again. The Mujahideen fought the exact way the Viet Cong had, with ambushes and hit-and-run raids in unforgiving terrain. The precise, short-burst, high-mobility fighting the RPD was born for. A belt-fed gun that one man could haul up a mountain and use to rake a stretch of road before vanishing into the rocks was worth its weight in gold to a guerrilla. Picture a Soviet supply column grinding through a narrow pass, hemmed in by rock on both sides, when a single RPD opens up from high above and walks its fire straight down the line of trucks. By the time the soldiers below even spotted the muzzle flash, the gunner had grabbed his drum and slipped back over the ridge. These were the same gut-punch raids that had bled the Americans a generation earlier, only now it was Soviet boys dying in the dust of their own guns. It still turns up today in conflicts across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, pulled from old Cold War stockpiles decades after the country that made it ceased to exist. But that brings us right back to the real question of this whole story. If the RPD was this good, this influential, and this hard to kill, then why on earth did it have such a downfall? The answer comes down to a cold, boring word that wins more wars than bravery ever does, and that word is logistics. You see, the RPD was a wonderful gun, but it was its own separate machine. It had its own parts, its own drum, its own belt feed, and its own training, all completely different from the AK-47 rifle the rest of the squad carried. So an army had to build, stock, and repair two entirely different weapons just to equip one rifle squad. And the Soviets, who loved nothing more than simplicity and mass production, looked at that and saw a waste. The runaway success of the AK-47 handed them a much cleaner idea. What if the squad's machine gun was just a slightly different version of the rifle everyone already carried? So they ran a competition for it, and the design that won belonged to Mikhail Kalashnikov, the father of the AK himself, and he gave them the RPK. The RPK was basically an AK-47 with the longer, heavier barrel, a bipod, and a bigger magazine, and that simple idea solved the whole problem in one move. It used the same ammunition, the same magazines, and the bulk of the same parts as the standard infantry rifle, so a soldier who knew the AK already understood most of the RPK. The Soviets accepted the Kalashnikov design in 1961, and it entered service in 1964, and that was the quiet death sentence for the RPD. But here's the part that makes its downfall so satisfying and so unfair at the same time. And this wasn't because the RPD was bad at all. The RPD was arguably the better pure machine gun because it was belt-fed, so it could sustain far longer bursts than the magazine-fed RPK ever could. Plenty of soldiers thought it was the more capable weapon in a stand-up fight. It could keep firing long after an RPK gunner had run his magazine dry and was left fumbling for the next one. But an army doesn't reward the best individual weapon. It rewards the one that's easiest to feed, fix, and field by the millions, and the RPK simply fit the system better. So the gun that pioneered the whole concept of the squad automatic weapon, the design everyone from the Americans onward would later copy, was retired by its own creators. It got benched purely for being too special, and when the Americans finally rolled out their own one-man belt-fed squad gun, the M249 SAW in the 1980s, they were really just catching up to the idea the RPD had reached decades earlier. And yet the RPD got the last laugh, in a way the tidy, logical RPK never could. While the RPK quietly did its job, the RPD went on to fight in nearly every nasty little war of the last 70 years. It gunned down patrols in the jungle, ambushed superpowers in the mountains, and earned itself a starring role in the video games and films that taught a whole generation what a machine gun even sounds like. The Soviets decided it wasn't worth the trouble, and history decided it was unforgettable anyway.